This episode may contain content of a graphic nature, including descriptions of physical and sexual violence against adults, children, and animals. Listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, I'm Talia.
And I'm Tanya.
And together we are Crimes and Consequences, a true crime podcast. Welcome back, everybody, to this week's exciting true crime episode from Crimes and Consequences. I'm sitting here with my lovely host, Tanya. Hi, Tanya.
Hey, Talia.
How are you doing?
I'm fabulous today.
Well, I've got a really good story for you guys today. I spent a lot of time researching this, probably way too long, but it's really interesting, and it's got a twist.
I love twists.
So you got to stay with me on it. Before I start, I want to ask everybody to just hit the subscribe/follow button. It really helps us. And after saying that, I'm ready to do it.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. This horror begins on Monday, September 12th, 1977 in Winton, Georgia. Now, Winton is a small village of Columbus, Georgia. It's like your quintessential American neighborhood. Most of the houses are modest size, but they all have the manicured lawns with the big old trees that you would expect in Georgia, with azaleas growing and black-eyed Susans. They're all very proud of their property. And Winton was described as a small village at times, and then other times it was just described as a neighborhood. So it's not big, okay?
Okay.
During this particular fall night, someone snuck into the home of 64-year-old Gertrude Miller. She was attacked by a man who hit her repeatedly in the head with a board, and then he brutally and violently raped her. He ransacked her dresser drawers, and he pulled out a pair of her nylon stockings. He tied them in a knot, but then he just left the house before stealing anything from her. Gertrude Miller was lucky. She survived this attack. But 4 days later, 58-year-old Mary Fern Jackson, who lived just down the road, wasn't so lucky. And when I say just down the road, I'm talking 2 blocks away. Mary went by Fern. She worked as the director of public health in the education department in Columbus for over 26 years. But on Friday, September 16th, she didn't show up to her office in the morning like she was supposed to. After failing to reach her for hours, her coworkers called the police and asked them to do a welfare check on Fern in her Winton house. Officer Jesse Thornton, he was the first police officer to respond. He arrived at Fern's house, and when he got there, no one answered the door. He didn't see anything off, like any signs of forced entry or anything. Everything looked fine on the outside of the house. He was able to obtain permission to enter Fern's house. And after opening the front door, he began to walk down the hallway, calling out to Fern. But all he heard in return was silence. His gut told him something was dangerously off with the situation. There were papers and other random items scattered all over the hallway floor. There was a pillow next to an open suitcase on the ground there. Also in the hallway was a small dresser. It was one of those that are more decorative than functional, and items were hanging outside the drawers of this little dresser. Officer Thornton made his way towards the door that was at the end of the hallway, and he wasn't taking any chances as he was walking down that hallway. He pulled out his gun, and as he approached the room, which happened to be Fern's bedroom, he hesitated, and then he slowly turned the doorknob and opened the door. As he peeked inside, he was able to see this shape of what looked like a body laying on the bed under a blanket. He walked over to the bed and he lifted up the blanket. That's when he saw the dead body of Fern Jackson. She was naked and there was this ligature wrapped around her neck. The ligature was comprised of a pair of her nylon stockings, and the stockings were tied to her bathrobe sash. Together they formed a single ligature. The robe sash and the nylons were wrapped tightly around her neck 3 times and then tied. They were so tightly around her neck that even after they were removed, there were deep crevices all over her neck. Fern had also been beaten and strangled. The white of her left eye was almost obliterated by bleeding. It was red instead of white. The coroner said that was a result of a massive blow to the head. Now, the white of her right eye was a mass of tiny pinpoint hemorrhages, and of course, that's a common sign in strangulation. Her breastbone had been fractured, and in order to fracture her breastbone, that would have required a tremendous amount of force to accomplish. In addition, her genitalia was bloodied, bruised, and torn from the violent rape. Further investigation revealed traces of seminal fluid on her bed sheets. Fern's murder was a real mystery to investigators because there was no obvious motive for her killing. Nothing was stolen from her house. Her house was ransacked, but jewelry and other valuables, they were just left there. Now, on the same day of Fern's murder, only a few miles away, 24-year-old Karen Hickman, she was an Army private. She was found dead near the women's barracks at Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia. Fort Benning is a large Army base. So you have Winton, which is an area or a village in Columbus, and you have a Fort Benning Army base. Like Fern, Karen was found nude and her body was mutilated from a severe beating. However, it wasn't the beating that killed her. Her killer had propped up her, I'm assuming, unconscious body against a tree and rammed his car into it repeatedly.
What?
Crushing her.
Oh my God.
She was crushed to death, and then after she was killed, her body was moved to the location where it was found near the woman's barracks.
Damn.
An investigation into her background didn't result in any leads or clues as to who would have brutalized her in such a horrific fashion. Detectives did discover that she dated exclusively only African American men, and she socialized in what was considered black clubs. Now, this is Georgia. So we're in the South, in the U.S., in the mid-70s, and racial tension is really high. So police questioned if maybe she wasn't killed as a result of her taste in men. A few days later, an anonymous man called the police and gave them the location where Karen's bloody clothes could be found. They never found out who called them about it.
That's creepy.
I know. Finding her clothes brought them no closer to catching her killer. And for the most part, they had no idea who killed Karen. It was only 8 days after Karen's murder that the Columbus police found themselves investigating the third murder of a woman in their jurisdiction in less than 2 weeks. 71-year-old Jean Demenstein was a widow, and she owned a small department store that she also worked at. She lived by herself in the Winton area in a brick-style ranch only 3 blocks from Fern. On the night of September 24th, a killer entered Jean's house through her garage. And this is really weird. Once he got into her garage, he removed the hinges of the door that led from the garage to the kitchen.
That's a weird thing to do.
I've never heard of breaking into someone's house by removing their door from their hinges.
That's how he got in the house?
Yes.
That's bizarre.
After he was inside, he walked quietly through her house and into the bedroom where she was sleeping. There he beat her, he raped her, and he strangled her to death with her nylon stocking that he found in her dresser. The killer covered her body with a sheet and pillow before he left. By this time, it was clear to everyone in the Columbus area that a serial killer was at large, and the community was in this huge panic. There was just this uproar of fear. The media dubbed the killer the Stocking Strangler and also the Granny Killer.
The Granny Killer?
The Granny Killer.
Oh, geez.
As more and more women began turning up dead, Private Karen Hickman's murder sort of went on the back burner, so to speak, because although she was Caucasian and all the other victims were Caucasian too, she didn't match the profile of the Stocking Strangler in the fact that she was an elderly. Instead, she was 24. She wasn't found in her home, and she wasn't strangled. Police believe that Karen's murder was just an unrelated incident. They developed a task force to catching the Stocking Strangler, and there just wasn't enough resources to devote to thoroughly investigate Karen's killer and catch him. 2 weeks later, police believe the killer tried to claim his next victim but wasn't successful. A man broke into the home of two elderly sisters called Kaylee East, she was 75, and Nellie Sanderson, who was 78. They both lived in Winton. But the would-be killer was surprised when he broke into the house and discovered that Nellie's son, Henry, was there visiting his mom. The perpetrator left, but managed to steal Nellie's gun on his way out. And this becomes a key point to the story. It was less than 2 weeks later when the Stocking Strangler struck again. This time, this is so sad. Florence Scheibel, she was 10 days shy of turning 90.
Oh, no.
She was almost blind and used a walker to get around. She turned up dead. She was a widow who lived alone in a small house in the Winton neighborhood. Her son and wife went to check on her because they did frequently. I mean, she's 90, almost blind with a walker. It was the morning of October 21st, and that's when they discovered her lifeless, battered body on her bed in the house. She'd been beaten, raped, strangled, and her killer had tied a pair of her nylons in a knot around her neck and watched her slowly strangled to death. Just like the other elderly women who'd been murdered, Florence's body was covered with a bed sheet by the killer. Police were able to find one thumbprint on the door frame leading to Florence's bedroom, but they weren't able to match that print with anybody in their system. 4 days after Florence was found dead, the killer crept into the house of 69-year-old Martha Thurmond. She was a retired teacher living in the Winton area. And again, I can't express to you guys, I have a map of the Winton area, and it's going to be on our website. This is a small area. Like, I would be freaking out if I was in Winton right now. He entered through her guest bedroom window in the rear of the house. Once inside, he quietly crept down her hallway and into her bedroom where she was sleeping. There he attacked her, and he beat her repeatedly. I mean, this was a very violent attack. He forced her clothes off of her, and he raped her. Then he took out a nylon stocking from her dresser, just like he did with everybody else, and he tied it around her neck in a knot and waited for her to die. Once she was dead, he placed a pillowcase and a bedsheet over her face, and he left. At that crime scene, police were able to find a pubic hair. That pubic hair was analyzed, and it was determined to be from an African-American man. So all of these women that are dead are Caucasian, and the killer is African-American. The killer went on a brief hiatus, as far as we know, but probably not. But there were further break-ins in the Winton area in the time frame when there weren't any murders. Then the killing spree started up again on December 28th. On that night, the killer removed the back window screen of the house of 74-year-old, her name was Karen Woodruff. She was the widow of the University of Georgia's former football coach, George Woodruff, if you're into football, which I'm not. He climbed through her window and he crept in her bedroom and he raped her, and then he murdered her by tying, instead of nylons, a University of Georgia varsity football scarf around her neck. Prints from his pinky finger and his palm were found on an aluminum frame of the screen, but again, there were no matches for that fingerprint anywhere. As you can imagine, Columbus is on edge. They know they have a very active serial killer prowling around a very small area. At that time, if you were an elderly woman that lived alone and was concerned for her safety, you could call the police and they would send a guard out to guard your house at night.
Really?
That's how...
Wow, that's serious.
Yeah. At the time, there was, again, a lot of racial tension. I mean, we have the South in the 1970s. This tension was inflamed by the fact that an African-American serial killer was on the loose, killing exclusively white elderly women. About 6 weeks later, on February 11th, in 1978, police responded to the bedside emergency button that was next to Ruth Schwab's bed in her home in Winton. Ruth was the widow of a textile tycoon, and she was trained in judo.
Was she really? That's awesome.
Trained in judo. While being attacked by the Stocking Strangler, she managed to push her bedside alarm button. When the police arrived in the house, they found her on the edge of her bed with a stocking tied around her neck. She'd been beaten, raped, and strangled, but she was alive. In investigating the scene, the police determined that her attacker had entered the house by standing on the air conditioning unit on the ground, propping himself up into the window, and then going through the window. They found shoe prints on the air conditioning unit. Ruth described her attacker as an African-American man in his mid-20s. Despite 2 women surviving the serial killer, the police were no closer to finding this monster than they were 6 months ago. The killer didn't even wait 24 hours before he struck again. After being interrupted by the panic alarm button set off by Ruth, he actually just ran out the back door, down the alleyway, and ended up 2 blocks away at the home of 78-year-old Mildred Borum. Mildred was found the next morning lying in the hallway of her home. She was on her back, and she'd been raped, strangled. This time, though, there wasn't a nylon stocking or a varsity scarf. It was a Venetian blind cord. Her face had been covered by her shirt, and again, there were just no clues as to who was doing this. But this is when the story takes a turn from strange to absolutely bizarre. And we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. As if the police weren't frazzled enough in Columbus, on Friday, March 3rd of 1978, Chief Curtis E. McClung of the Columbus Police Department, he received a letter in the mail addressed to him. And this is just so odd. It's a handwritten letter claiming to be from a group of white vigilantes who called themselves the Forces of Evil.
What the hell is this?
This gets so strange. In the letter, the Forces of Evil expressed their deep anger over elderly white women being murdered by a black man. They specifically demanded, quote, that no more grannies be killed, end quote. The letter stated further, and I'll just quote it for you. Since the coroner says that the Stocking Strangler is black, we decided to come here to Columbus and catch him or put more pressure on you. From now on, one black woman in Columbus, Georgia will be disappearing every month if the Strangler isn't caught. End quote.
Are you shitting me?
I am not shitting you.
They're going to murder a black lady.
Yes.
If the Strangler doesn't get caught.
It makes complete sense.
Oh my God. Because the police really don't want to catch him or anything. Jesus.
It gets weirder.
Oh, good.
In the letter, they indicated that an organization within the Forces of Evil's organization had already kidnapped a black woman named Gail Jackson and were holding her hostage. They threatened to kill Gail Jackson if the Stocking Strangler was not caught by June 1st. In addition, they demanded that the police chief communicate with them by public radio no later than Sunday, which was 2 days after he received the letter.
Dear Forces of Evil. On public radio? This is so stupid.
We're going to interrupt your disco right now
with a message to the Forces of Evil.
The letter was written on military stationery, but being that Fort Benning military base was in Columbus, the stationery from that base wasn't hard to get by non-military personnel. So they didn't know if that was to throw them off or if he was in the Army. It'd be kind of stupid if you're in the Army to send a letter.
Military stationery.
But as we know, there's a lot of dumbass murderers out there.
Lots of them out there.
The salutation was signed by, quote, the chairman of the Forces of Evil, end quote.
Right at the top.
So it's got a chairman. The police immediately began trying to figure out who Gail Jackson was. They had no missing person reports for anyone with that name, and they'd never heard of the organization or group with the name Forces of Evil. There was a woman named Brenda Gale Fison who disappeared from the Sandhill Bar, which is near Fort Benning, on February 28th. Brenda was a sex worker, and she was last seen at the Sandhill Bar. Her car was found left at the parking lot, but she couldn't be located. But she had that sort of transient lifestyle, so there really wasn't any connection, the police thought, to her. The next 4 weeks, 4 more letters were sent to the Columbus police chief and 1 to the newspaper from the Forces of Evil. The second of these letters once again demanded that the Stocking Strangler be caught, and you're going to really like this part, Tanya, be caught, or in the alternative, the Forces of Evil be given $10,000 ransom.
For what? For Gail?
For Gail. for her safe release.
You're going to demand ransom from the police.
You have to catch a serial killer or give us money, or we're going to murder people.
Who is this genius?
Well, you'll
thinking
find out.
Of this? I know, I can't wait.
You'll find out. I don't think genius is the appropriate word for him. It also stated that 2 more black women would be murdered by September 1st if the Stocking Strangler was still at large. Now, the police didn't respond on public radio to the first letter, and they did not respond to this letter either. A week after the second letter was sent, a third letter was received by Chief McClung. In the third letter, the forces of evil indicated that they were a small group of 7 white men from Chicago. In retaliation of the police failure to capture the Stocking Strangler or pay them $10,000, they were preparing to kill Gail Jackson. The letter stated that one of Gail Jackson's elbows would be dislocated, she would die from a sharp blow to her head, and her body would be found dumped in the Sand Hill area of Columbus. It further stated that the police could expect to receive a call indicating the exact location of Gail Jackson's remains in a few days. Equally disturbing in the letter, the forces of evil wrote that they'd already kidnapped another African-American woman named Irene. Irene would be murdered, like Gail, before June 1st if the Stocking Strangler wasn't caught, or in the alternative, they weren't given $10,000. True to their word, 3 days later, a man claiming to be the chairman for the forces of evil telephoned Fort Benning Military Police and the Columbus Police Department separately within minutes of each other. The chairman told investigators the exact location of Gail Jackson's remains, stating that her body would be found 100 meters from the Sand Hill bar. The military police and the police receptionist who received the calls, they both believed the caller sounded like a black man. Following the information provided them by the chairman in this call, investigators went to this wooded area not far from the Sand Hill bar. Now remember, the Sand Hill bar is very close to Fort Benning. When they got there, that's when they discovered a female's body in a very shallow grave. There were some twigs and leaves on it, but it was exactly where the chairman had said it would be. This is gruesome. I should have mentioned that this gets very gruesome. The victim's entire face and the front portion of her skull were annihilated. Parts of her jawbone, bone chips, and teeth were scattered around her. Some were 9 feet away. The victim's brain tissue was literally beaten from her skull.
Oh.
The force of the killer's attack was so great that it produced a depression in the ground behind the victim's head.
Oh my God.
He was angry and strong. The cause of death was multiple compound fractures of the skull and face and evulsion, aka removal of the victim's brain. According to the medical examiner, the woman most likely was beaten with a tire iron or a jack handle, and just as the chairman had described, the victim's elbow had been dislocated. Located near the body was an army cap. The woman was later ID'd as 21-year-old African-American Brenda Gail Fison, the sex worker who'd been missing for over a month. Brenda had used the alias Gail Jackson when she was working. At this point, the poor Columbus police, they had their hands full, and they requested the help of the FBI to catch the forces of evil. And I think the GBI was involved too. This is where profiler Robert Ressler comes into the picture. And you know I love Robert Ressler. Mm-hmm. And I'm also aware I called him Robert Kessler the last time I talked about him. So please nobody let me know that, because I already do. I know. Profiler Robert Ressler read the letters that were sent by the forces of evil. And he also listened to the recording of the chairman's voice on the 2 phone calls, one to the police and one to the military police. Based on his analysis, he said the forces of evil wasn't a group of white radicals, but a single black man. Ressler created this profile of the killer. He believed he was a serviceman in his late 20s, and this was evidenced by the fact that he used meters instead of yards. Because you and I would have said 6 yards away or something like that, or feet. Based on the writing style of the letters, Ressler believed he wasn't a college graduate and was probably either military police or artillery. Robert also said that the letters were merely a diversion to throw investigators off the trail for murders that had already been committed.
Oh.
The medical examiner's results supported this theory because Brenda Gale Bison had died over a month earlier, prior to even the first letter having been written. Robert Ressler believed the key to catching the killer would be to examine the life of the victims. Of course, Brenda's life was a little bit different than most. She was a sex worker, and the only thing they could discover that was somewhat stood out was that she exclusively only had African American clients. The next day, the chief of police received another letter from the forces of evil. This letter indicated that the hostage named Irene was going to be killed soon, and that investigators could expect to receive a call detailing the location of her remains. Once again, true to their word, the chairman of the forces of evil called the Fort Benning desk sergeant on April 3rd. He gave the sergeant directions to the location of Irene's remains. She'd been dumped in this semi-secluded area not far from an access road, really close to the Fort Benning base. And this is going to get gruesome.
Oh, boy.
When they got to the exact location specified by the caller, they found the headless body of a woman hidden under some logs near a rifle range on the Fort Benning base. She was nude. The reason why she was headless, because her head had been beaten so severely that there was just nothing left.
Are you kidding me?
It wasn't cut off. It was just beaten to nothing. There were marks on the ground indicating that the killer had dragged her from the road to her final resting spot. And I just want to reiterate, there was nothing for a head there. The body was later identified by the medical examiner to be 32-year-old Irene Thurklin. Irene was last seen on March 15th, so this is 2.5 weeks before her body was found. In investigating her murder, they discovered that she'd been seen talking to a soldier at a place called the Vice Mitchell's Tavern. 2 witnesses came forward and told investigators that they saw an Army private leave the tavern with Irene, and they recognized him. He was a 26-year-old soldier named William Henry Hance. Tape recordings of the phone calls made by the chairman of the Forces of Evil, they were played to William Hance's company commander and first sergeant, and both of those men said the voice sounded just like William's. The previous year had been a hard one for William. His wife left him, and he had a lot of debt. In addition, his invalid mother, someone had burglarized her house and beaten and raped her, and this guy never got caught. She ended up dying as a result of the assault. Investigators confronted William about being the last person seen with Irene, and he agreed to be taken to the headquarters for a formal interview. The interview started at 1 p.m., and it didn't end until 10:20, some 9 hours later. During that time, William confessed to writing letters. He said, yeah, I wrote the letters, and I made the phone calls, but the forces of evil made me do it. The next morning, he was interviewed again, and he dropped all the bullshit about being forced to participate by the forces of evil. He admitted that there was no forces of evil. He was the forces of evil. And he gave detailed accounts of Brenda and Irene's murder, but that's not all he confessed to. Here's what happened to Brenda. On Monday, February 27th, William went to the Sand Hill Bar and Grill, which is not far from the Fort Benning base, and he wanted to unwind and have a couple drinks. Brenda approached William and sat at his table and told him her name was Gail Jackson. After some small talk, she propositioned him for sex in exchange for $20. He agreed, and she suggested they get in his car and drive to the secluded area where she'd often have her rendezvous. It wasn't very far down the road. It was about actually 200 yards. While he was driving, Brenda started taking off her bra and shirt. That's when William said something in him snapped. He just became enraged for no other reason than Brenda was a prostitute in his car. He suddenly grabbed Brenda and he started beating her. She opened the door and tried to escape, but he struck her with a, quote, karate chop across the head, and she became unconscious. She fell across the door and her head was bleeding. I mean, this has to be some serious
karate chop, damn.
Right, Bruce Lee shit. Yeah. William grabbed her from under her arms and he dragged her about 30 yards into the woods. While he was dragging her, he heard this popping sound, and it was the sound of her elbow dislocating.
Ugh.
According to William, he thought Brenda was dead. That's when he got the jack handle from his trunk to finish her off. He returned to where Brenda was in the woods, and he noticed she was still breathing. She was alive. That's when he beat her with a tire jack with such force and such savagery that her face, from the top of the eyes down, was completely missing. Parts of her jaw, with teeth still attached, along with hundreds of pieces of her skull, were scattered 9 feet from her body. William had found an army cap with a different insignia than his units, and he placed that cap near Brenda's body in order to avert suspicion from him.
Oh, that'll throw him off.
Next, William confessed to Irene's murder. 2 weeks after he killed Brenda, he went alone to Vice Mitchell's bar to get some drinks, where Irene was there. Irene was a sex worker too, and she began making conversation with him. She asked him if he wouldn't mind giving her a ride to the Sand Hill bar. He said okay, and again, this is according to him. While they were driving, Irene asked him if he'd be interested in having sex with her for some cash. He originally agreed to do it, but then as she started removing her clothes, once again, he said he lost all sense of control and his, quote, mind had flipped. He grabbed a tire iron from the back seat and began beating Irene. William eventually led the investigators to the location of the murder weapons and also Irene and Brenda's clothes, because some of their clothes were missing. He also provided handwriting samples, and those samples, surprise, surprise, matched the Forces of Evil letters. And then on one of the letters, there was a fingerprint which matched William. So he did it, okay? While he was in police custody, William admitted to murdering Army Private Karen Hickman, which was prior to the murders of Brenda and Irene. Unlike Brenda and Irene, Karen wasn't a sex worker and she wasn't African American. He didn't provide any justification for her killing, but he did admit to beating her and propping her up against the tree and ramming his car repeatedly into her body. With a confession of 3 murders, police were hoping that they could link William to the Stocking Strangler killings. However, there was no connection. But they did discover that prior to Karen Hickman's murder on the Fort Benning base in 1977, another woman had been murdered at the Fort Benjamin Harrison base in Lawrence Township, Indiana. Coincidentally, William was stationed there.
Really?
I don't have a lot of details on it, but it was earlier in 1977, the same year that Karen was killed and a year before the other 2 were. A young black woman was found beaten and murdered in a similar fashion to William's other victims. To this day, he's considered a suspect in the murder, but they can't prove he did. So that would be a total of 4 killings. While William was in custody, only 2 weeks, another elderly woman in Columbus was murdered. On April 19th, 61-year-old elementary school teacher Janet Coffer's body was found lying in her bed, and it was found with a linen and a pillow covering her face. She had deep bite marks around her nipple of her left breast, and she'd been raped, strangled with a nylon stocking. Now, Janet Coffer didn't reside in Winton, but on the night she was murdered, she had choir practice in Winton, and she only lived 1.5 miles away. As quickly as the Columbus Stocking Strangler began his killing spree, the murder stopped. Janet's was the last. They remained unsolved for 6 years until 1984, when the police finally got the break they needed to capture this guy. And when they caught him, they discovered that his murderous killing rampage didn't start and didn't end in Columbus, Georgia. In case you thought the serial killer all of a sudden just changed his life about. Oh, God. In 1984, police were able to locate the gun that was stolen from the 2 sisters' home in Winton in the midst of the Stocking Strangler's killing spree. The gun was in possession, actually in Detroit, they found the gun. The gun was in possession of a man named Jim Gary, who is from Alabama. When authorities confronted Jim, he told authorities that he purchased the gun from his nephew, whose name was Carlton Gary. Carlton Gary was no stranger to the law. An investigation into his background revealed he was connected to similar murders of elderly women in New York, but he never got charged with any of them. In fact, he testified as a witness for the prosecution in the murder trial of one of his own victims.
Are you shitting me?
This guy's good. Let me tell you a little bit about Carlton. Carlton was born in 1950 in Columbus, Georgia. He continued to live there until he was 16, and then he moved with his mom to Fort Myers, Florida. Before he was even 18 years old, he was convicted of assaulting a police officer and arson. So he spent some time in the juvenile home. When he got out, he moved to Albany, New York. When he was 20 years old, on April 14th in 1970, this is 7 years before the Stocking Strangler emerged in Columbus, the body of 85-year-old Nellie Farmer was found in the room of a Wellington hotel. That was where she lived. It was a long-stay hotel in Albany, New York. Like the Stocking Strangler's victims, she'd been raped, strangled, and her body was covered with a sheet. After she was murdered, her killer walked over to the bathroom sink and he stood on the bath mat and he washed his hands. So there were shoe impressions left on the mat. In addition, police found one fingerprint at the crime scene. And this story, I could go on for hours about it. There's so many details I'm going to leave out because nobody needs to hear all of it. It'll just get more confusing. But in the end, they were able to link the fingerprint to 20-year-old Carlton Gary. And they arrested him for Nellie's murder. But when he was confronted with the evidence, he admitted that he was at the crime scene, but he was only there to burglarize and be a lookout. He tried to work out a deal with the prosecutors, and he said that he would testify against his accomplice, whose name was John Lee Mitchell, in order to have reduced charges. He was so convincing that John Lee Mitchell was tried for the murder of Nellie, and Carlton testified against him. Luckily for John, the jury acquitted him of the murder because it was all shit. It was Carlton, clearly now, in retrospect. However, Carlton was convicted of burglary, and as part of the plea deal for testifying, he got sentenced to 10 years. I mean, if you think about it, he basically, with his confession, admitted to felony murder. So he got 10 years for it. But he only had to serve 5, because it's 1975. It's 1975. 100 years means 2. But that isn't the only heinous crime linked to Carlton in New York. Another elderly woman had been raped, beaten, and strangled right before Nellie's murder. She survived her attack, but her attacker was never caught. So Carlton did 5 years in prison, and he got out in 1975. On June 27, 1975, school teacher Marion Brewer Fisher, she was 40. She disappeared while leaving a bar in Syracuse, New York. Her body was found the next day on the side of the road, just outside of Syracuse. And of course, like everybody else I'm talking about, she'd been raped and strangled. Now, this is interesting. In 2007, a cold case unit processed semen found on Marion's body for DNA. Because in 1975, we couldn't process DNA, and her case went unsolved for 32 years. When they ran that DNA through CODIS, who do you think it ended up being from?
Carlton?
Yes!
No. I'm always surprised DNA lasts that long.
It did.
That they were able to preserve it.
However, back in 1975, again, police had no idea who killed Marion. Even though Carlton was out of prison, as you can probably imagine, he didn't stay out of trouble for very long. He was arrested again for assault and violating parole, and then he ended up going back to prison. In 1977, Carlton escaped from the New York prison by jumping out the third-story window. Didn't Ted Bundy do that?
Yes, I think it was the third-story window.
Immediately after his escape, 55-year-old Jean Frost was beaten, raped, and murdered during a burglary of her home in Syracuse, New York. One of the items taken during the burglary was her watch. It didn't take long for the police to capture Carlton. As a matter of fact, it only took 2 days. When they found him, he had the stolen watch in his pocket. And now this is where it just gets stupid. Carlton confessed, yeah, I was there when, all that happened to Jean, but I was just a lookout for my friend Dudley Harris, who he blamed for the rape and murder.
Man, he is in the wrong place at the wrong time.
I know.
Again.
And that's not for the last time either, by the way. In the end, no one ended up being convicted for her murder. Later that year, Carlton was released from prison. Even though he just escaped, they let him out.
Of course they did.
And he headed south to his hometown in Columbus, Georgia. And it was only within 2 weeks that Gertrude was attacked. Carlton stayed in Columbus until April of the following year, and then he left. And coincidentally, that's when the murder stopped. He then moved to South Carolina, where he became known as, are you ready for this? The Steakhouse Bandit. He got the nickname the Steakhouse Bandit because he robbed restaurants at gunpoint right before closing time. He eventually got caught because during one of his robberies of a steakhouse, one of the waitresses there that he had held in the back with everybody else that just ran the restaurant realized his gun didn't have bullets in it. And I'm not sure how, but she yelled out, "You don't even have any bullets in your gun." And then he took off running, and he was caught a couple hours later in a swamp. So he got sent back to prison. However, after 5 years, he escaped again. I can't make this up. He was actually on the run from that escape when the police caught up with him for the murders of the Stocking Strangler in a hotel in Georgia in 1984. Now, Carlton was different than William Hance in a lot of ways. And one of the things I didn't mention before, but I'm going to say now, is William Hance tried to argue that he was mentally retarded, but he had an IQ test of 91. He had another one of 76, and neither one of them are mentally retarded. Carlton was different. He had a high IQ. He was characterized as having, quote, a superstar quality, end quote, about him. He was a talented musician, and he loved to wear the most top-notch suits, sports coats, and even a bow tie.
Oh, Lord.
He was considered handsome and charming, and he always had beautiful girlfriends. His friends and family were shocked by his arrest. They just couldn't wrap their mind around him raping elderly women when he could have the most beautiful girlfriends. He often went to nightclubs. He was very social. He played music at nightclubs, and people really liked him. After his arrest, Carlton admitted to the police to being present at the scene of 7 of the Winton crimes, but he blamed his friend Melvin Crittenden for the attack.
I didn't do it. I was there for every single one.
He blamed Melvin for the attack on Gertrude, and then the other incidences, he said he just coincidentally burglarized those houses.
Right before the ladies were murdered?
Yes. He was hoping to work out a deal, but the police were not falling for it this time. He told the police that when he would burglarize the homes, he would wait in the bushes for hours sometimes. He would even pee in the bushes. He said he just sat in the bushes and he just waited for the most perfect moment to break in. He went on trial in 1986. At the trial, Gertrude testified that Carlton was her attacker. Now, she's the one that survived the first attack. But in all fairness to Carlton, she also identified 3 other African-American men as being her attacker prior to him.
Well, Melvin.
Right? Melvin actually testified for the prosecutor. On August 26, in 1986, after only 1 hour of deliberation, the jury of 9 Caucasians and 3 African Americans came back with a guilty verdict, but only for the murders of Florence, Martha, and Kathleen. The next day, he was condemned to death by them. Carlton maintained his innocence. Wasn't me. And in 2012, DNA analysis came back. It had been conducted on some of the evidence. And this is interesting. The DNA found on Gertrude didn't match Carlton.
Really?
Did not. In all fairness, it didn't. She identified 3 other people before him. However, it was a match for Jean, Fern, Florence, Martha, and Nellie's murders. So that's where we are with Carlton Gary. William Hance, the forces of evil. He was found, his was much more complicated. There was a military court and then there was a civilian court. But in the end, long story short, he was found guilty of the 3 murders of Karen, Brenda, and Irene. He was sentenced to death. And Brenda's family actually asked that he not be put to death. They asked that he get life, but the prosecutor went ahead and went for the death penalty and got it. On March 31st, 1984, at 10:10 p.m., 43-year-old William Henry Hance was put to death in Georgia's electric chair. Before his death, he gave a 7-minute final statement in which one of his lines was, quote, Why are you executing an innocent man? Why? Why? End quote.
Denied it till the end.
Even though he admitted it. He confessed.
Know. What the hell?
So that is the story of when the Stocking Strangler met the forces of evil.
Forces of evil. How stupid. God. Wow, Talia. That's a lot to unpack.
I know. So ridiculous.
It was fascinating, though.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, everybody, for taking some time out of your life to listen to us. If you haven't done so already, we would really appreciate you subscribing or hitting that follow button. It's on the app you're listening to right now. You can also go to our website, TNT Crimes. We've got a lot of cool things there. You can listen to our episodes there. You can also get some unreleased episodes there or become a member. We have really cool things under membership. You can go to our website, TNT Crimes, to learn more, or patreon.com/TNT Crimes. When you become a member, you get access to the full episodes and all the minis that we have and bonus stuff. Also, we got social media.
We are on Instagram and Facebook.
Oh, yeah. And we've got TikTok, True Crime Podcast. Why don't you just, for shits and giggles, go to TikTok and support us?
Talia will tell you how to get out of a speeding ticket.
I will. It's on TikTok. One quick thing before we go that's really important. I gotta give credit where credit's due. I got my info from not only the court cases, but also Murderpedia, LedgerInquirer.com, a New York Times article, and WTVM. So credit to where credit's due. Thank you guys for helping me research this case. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Until next week.
Stay safe and don't kill each other.
Bye.
Bye.